Welcome back to the new Thinkery. My name is David Barr, as usual. With me is Alex Priu,
How's it going, David?
going well, and Greg McBrayer.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. I wanted to start with a little story. So I'm with over at my in-laws in North Carolina. We're hanging out in the backyard with the kids, an inflatable pool, and it's hot, and it's just unpleasant for me as a father to just sit there. I'm looking around. I see this hawk. It's way up in the tree. It's like 20 feet away, though. And it's just hanging out. And it's a magnificent bird if you've ever been close to a hawk. And all of a sudden, it kind of like careens toward the ground. And it clutches up a baby rabbit. And my mother-in-law had earlier told the story to my children that there was this family of rabbits outside. And to keep their eyes peeled, because they might see the baby rabbit. My daughter's 2.5. She go, baby rabbit, baby rabbit. And there ain't no more baby rabbit. But
it seems like a great segue to Machiavelli. It's a lesson these kids need to learn a little early in life, right? That's kind of the way of the world.
Yeah.
Don't be a rabbit.
Yeah, and I was going to invent like my own augury around it.
Oh, that's
to enjoin them to go to sleep. Otherwise, they'll end up taken away by a big bird. But anyway,
seems like are you writing a children's book about how to raise children, David?
No.
Oh, no. You should.
Well, I have to wait till they're older.
Oh, I see. So make sure they turn out okay first.
Yeah. Otherwise,
I think you'd be good to write Aesop for dummies. That's what this sounds like.
Aesop was an ancient fabulist.
I thought the Aesop for dummies was the French version.
La Fontaine? Okay, I guess you're La Fontaine for dummies then.
Yeah. So today we're talking about Machiavelli's The Prince. This book's published in 1532. It doesn't need much of an introduction. I think most of our listeners are well acquainted with the book. They know who Machiavelli is, or at least have heard of Machiavelli in some capacity. But I think a brief refresh is probably useful. So, Greg, I know you've taught, both you and Alex actually have taught this book recently. Can you kind of describe what kind of text it is? I mean, it's fairly short. There are 26 chapters, but what is it? I mean, is it a treatise? It's sometimes described as a philosophic book. It's other times described as a book of political science. So it's weird, kind of seemingly hybrid text. But what's Machiavelli doing? What's the structure of the book? What's at play here? Just give us a general introduction.
Yeah, sure. So this book would have been written in the early 1500s. I guess it wasn't published until after Machiavelli's death. But it was circulated before his death among friends, but I think even more broadly, actually more widely. You might know it, David. Actually, Shakespeare quotes Machiavelli not much later, so there's some idea that this is actually percolating out there and getting out. Right. What kind of a book is it? It's in a way it seems awfully conventional or customary. There was a kind of a book called Mirrors of Princes, and this book would seem to fall into that category. It's short and seems to offer advice to princes on how to rule. I think Alex is going to lay out very neatly for us a little bit later that appearance is somewhat deceiving. It's not actually simply a mirror of princes. It's actually something much more novel, something much more radical even. It's short, as I mentioned, a mere 26 chapters plus an epistle dedicatory. One could read it in an evening if one wanted to. What kind of a book is it? I think it's fun. I enjoy reading it. I think it's actually quite funny. I think there are jokes in it, but you have to be maybe a certain type to find these jokes funny. Maybe not a nice person, but a nasty person. Machiavelli has this. Go ahead.
In the book, I mean, it's popular everywhere. I mean, from the lowest rungs of society to, well, the academics are already on a lower rung, but everybody loves this book.
Didn't Tupac have a song about Machiavelli?
Reputation. Tupac has an album called
Album. See, I should have known you would know better.
Yeah. No, I own it, and so he's a favorite among rappers. And this is also where Machiavelli kind of cements his reputation as a teacher of evil, which we can talk about later.
I hope we do talk about that for sure. I think that the reputation for evil or nastiness is definitely warranted. It at least warrants an initial kind of investigation. I mean, he seems to be trying to corrupt us and to make us sort of morally bad, but using humor, among other things, as some tools. I do hope we return to that. The book, as I see it, 26 chapters or so, but it falls into four main parts. The first part of the book, seemingly straightforwardly tries to sort of lay out the various kinds of principalities or different types of regimes that are ruled by princes. He's not going to talk about other kinds of government. He's not going to talk about republics, the only other kind, he says. So he goes through in the first 11 chapters outlining various kinds of ways that principalities can be run. He makes all kinds of distinctions like between hereditary principalities versus acquired principalities. There's a chapter on ecclesiastical principalities, so seemingly run by the church. That's just a taxonomy. It seems to be simply a taxonomy of types of principalities. The next part is sort of famous, where Machiavelli lays out, and it's only 3 chapters, it's somewhat short, but he lays out sort of the foreign policy for a prince, how a prince ought to behave or treat enemies. This contains the famous discussion of one's own of arms, different kinds of arms, one's own arms, mercenary arms, auxiliary arms. The next set of chapters 15 through 23, seems to be an investigation of the qualities that a prince ought to have. What should a prince be like? How should he treat his subjects and friends? So you see a distinction there. The previous chapters were on how a prince should behave toward enemies. Then you have a sort of set of chapters about how princes should behave toward friends and the qualities that a good prince ought to have. There's obviously a lot being mixed up in there, and we'll get to that in just a moment. The final set of chapters, as I understand it, seem to do with prudence and chance, or if I were to speak more generally, Machiavelli's view of the world and how human beings ought to operate in the world given this particular understanding of the world. Now, if I were to say, if you were to compel me to say, okay, what are 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 things that one should talk about this book, I think I've already sort of indicated some of them, but maybe first would be Machiavelli's account of nature and fortune. So how human beings ought to act in the world with respect to fortune, that seems to be extremely important. Second, another topic I just mentioned, we should talk about Machiavelli's account of virtue and relying on your own arms. So there's something about being an excellent human being has to do with being sort of, I'll use some loose terminology, self-sufficient, being able to depend upon yourself, not depending upon others. Thirdly, Machiavelli seems to sort of disregard previous political philosophy, previous thought for being overly fantastic, imaginative. And he seems to be saying, look, let's look at the way the world really is and let's be realistic about things. So Machiavelli has a turn to realism. And then lastly, I mean, you mentioned it, it's what he's sort of famous, if not infamous for, this reputation for evil. I'll only mention, of course, that, I mean, this guy, Machiavelli has a word. There's an English word derived from his name, Machiavellian, that is synonymous with being nasty or evil or underhanded. Plato, by contrast, right, has an adjective for his platonic. And I believe it's what girls would say to you, David, in high school and college when you would ask them out. They would say, no, they wanted to just be platonic. So right. Plato, friendly. Machiavelli, nasty.
Well, that's when I had to turn Machiavellian schema. But really quick,
he actually writes romance novels about how to conquer, Well,
he would get me too'd faster than he would. It's not the exact. But really quick before we dive in, just 1 or 2 sentences on what the project is in The Prince. I know that's very difficult. You have a paper that's coming out,
sure,
on one of, maybe he has a few different projects, but just say very briefly.
Sure, this is where I get to say things that sound like I'm exaggerating or being hyperbolic, I suppose. So Machiavelli's writing in the 1500s. The world is corrupt as he sees it. I think he has grand visions for himself. I think he sees himself in the same plane as a Socrates or a Jesus. I think he sees himself as someone who's going to try and change the world for the better. And principally what that means is I think he's going to try and improve politics such that the lives of all human beings, but I guess especially those in the West, will be improved. And the chief, I'm hesitant to say this, but I think the chief obstacle to human happiness, as Machiavelli sees it in the 1500s, is the current religion in which the world has found itself. So I see Machiavelli as tackling directly head on the Catholic Church, but if I'm being honest, even more generally, I think Christianity. He thinks that it has left people sort of it's left human beings. This is really counterintuitive, I suppose, but it's left us to be prey to princes who would rule us completely to their own benefit. So I think he's actually trying to usher in something like the modern world that we all inhabit. So if I were to, why should one study this book? My pitch to students is always, we, without even knowing it, are Machiavellians. We live in the world that he began to set in motion. And there's so many ways that one could trace this. I mean, his influences on modern science, which I hope Alex will speak about, and his influence on politics it's just undeniable. He influenced the later thinkers like Hobbes, Spinoza, Locke, who would then in turn influence, for example, say the Federalist Papers and Madison. So in many ways, the United States of America is a regime that by hook or by crook indirectly is ultimately Machiavelli is responsible for it, I think.
Well, and certainly the notion of ambition counteracting ambition has a Machiavellian psychology behind it. About the point about Christianity, I think it's important to recognize the particular version of Christianity that had risen up in his time. I think especially focusing on Julius II and the way in which he used Christianity as a political tool.
Definitely.
I think when you look at that, and I think he's in a way Machiavelli's ideal of a prince, much more than Cesare Borgia, for example. But in any case, I do think that there was a kind of Christianity and a certain use of Christianity politically as a sort of using the spiritual power to increase temporal power, as he would put it, that for Machiavelli threatened to be very insidious to politics.
Absolutely.
I'm not sure that the Machiavellian project would have worked a few hundred years before.
No, I don't.
That's to say, yeah. I think the political turmoil being what it was, in addition to the aspirations of the church, that set the stage for much as it did with Bacon and Descartes. The status of Christianity when you're engaged in these sort of sectarian wars, you have all this disenfranchised Christian sentiment. I think that creates the necessity for some alternative or some outlet or some revival of what has been set aside by this. For Machiavelli being a kind of Roman warlike virtue.
No question at all. I'll just say also, this will undercut my contention that Machiavelli is a nasty guy, but I think he was actually somewhat impressed by and sought to imitate. I think he was sympathetic to the goals of Christianity to improve the lives of human beings. And maybe we'll get to this later on. I think he actually was also somewhat impressed by the modes or the ways in which Christianity had sort of tried to achieve its goals and therefore imitated it.
And interesting. Sorry, did you want to say something else?
No, go ahead, David.
I think this is something that we've discussed off the air before, but one way some listeners may be, I think, rightly incredulous when they hear us describe Machiavelli as having ushered in this world historical change. But one way to evaluate what we're saying is simply by looking at, and this is where I think Alex and Greg, better than I, what philosophers that immediately followed him in thought and in time said about Machiavelli and his influence. And also what they didn't say about him directly, because I think we forget now to call somebody a Machiavellian. There are books written with Machiavellian in the title, and it's like MBAs for the Machiavellian, or like, you know what I'm saying? It's like they're business advice books. And it's all kind of a joke.
I think they may have missed one of the fundamental points, but yes.
Right. and so, but that was a very dirty accusation. Following his death, it's very, very serious. So, just to backtrack, some of the philosophers like Bacon, and I think Alex can illuminate this well, that I think took up his project and were making this claim that he had a project. The eggshells of Machiavelli, the aroma of Machiavelli are about Bacon, but it's a lot of these guys aren't saying his name directly.
Yeah, I would add on that, right? So just to go back to something that Greg said about, Machiavelli maybe sharing some Christian sentiment. certainly, the way he sets up the prince as a gift, there's a kind of generosity, right? If we discount the simple-minded view that Machiavelli is actually looking for a job, just obviously a bit ridiculous considering he never published the work and there's no evidence he gave it to Lorenzo, then we have to ask, what is this conceit about? Why this idea of a gift of knowledge to those in power? Bacon does a similar thing in The Great Instauration, where he presents the work as, to James the First, King James I of England. Likewise, too, in Descartes, there's this great virtue of generosity. In those ways, I think you do see a continued Christian impulse, a kind of charity, we could even call it, that runs through these modern thinkers. More to the point about the connection with Machiavelli to Bacon, at one point in the Advancement of Learning, Bacon cites the first chapter of Book 3 of the Discourses on Livy. And when he cites it, he's basically saying something to the fact that I'm going to expand upon what Machiavelli has disclosed here about government. I'm going to expand
that's his other great book, right, Alex? That's his other.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a much longer book. The Discourses on the first 10 books of Titus Livy. For the listeners, I'll just read the first sentence. It is a very true thing that all worldly things have a limit to their life, a kind of natural limit, we could say. But generally those go to the whole course that is ordered for them by heaven. So I think this is nature as chance, it seems like. That do not disorder their body, but keep it ordered. That is, keep it ordered through their own hands, so that either it does not alter, or if it alters, it is for its safety and not to its harm. So there's an attempt to undercut that part of nature that's dictated by chance or by fortune, Machiavelli says, that then Bacon wants to expand to a kind of natural science. That would be one, I think, important parallel, that Bacon is explicitly saying, I got this from Machiavelli.
Can I just jump in here and say there are thinkers? Bacon mentions Machiavelli a few times, but you're right, David, that because of this reputation that Machiavelli has for nastiness, there's a disinclination to point out your connection to him. And so the project that I'm saying, and listeners probably, if they're not already persuaded by us and they're not just our friends and family, they're going to be like, this sounds a little preposterous. And to be honest, I think that that's their right to be suspicious that we're just making this all up. But I mean, I think that you put your finger on the reason why we can't point to this direct influence on thinkers like Hobbes and Locke, because they don't mention him by name. There are some passages that lead me to think that it seems clear that they were indebted to Machiavelli. So Hobbes' account of human nature, right, sounds nasty, and it sounds just like the account of human nature that Machiavelli gives in The Prince, chapter 17, right? The men are fickle and ungrateful and pretenders and evaders of danger, and they're scared, right? This sort of similar dark view of human nature left to itself. And to what extent, even as the entire state of nature conceit, sort of based on a Machiavellian idea or Machiavellian distinction between foundings and perpetuations, right? Or foundings and maintainings. I think that inclination, the seed of that is there in the state of nature. Locke, for example, will talk about human acquisitiveness and how that's a very natural thing. And that comes straight out of Machiavelli as well. Machiavelli thinks that human nature is by nature acquisitive. And so I think you see the seeds. I have another example I'd be happy to give that's a little more. Sometimes when I read Machiavelli, my students they roll their eyes because I get sometimes deep into this the numbers business. But so Machiavelli in the first chapter lists 13 types of principalities. There's some indication other places that we can cut this later if we need to, but that 13 is an important number for Machiavelli. The chapter where Hobbes lays out the state of nature is the 13th chapter of his famous Leviathan. So that is only circumstantial evidence. I realize that if you're already skeptical of us, you're not going to be persuaded by that. But there are these little nuggets, I think, that you start to see the influence being fleshed out.
But I think we can even just take so Bacon clearly is influenced by Machiavelli.
For sure.
There's also some amazing parallels between Descartes' work and Bacon's, to the point that I was reading an interesting article by a French philosopher.
Descartes and Machiavelli?
No, by André Lalande.
No, I'm sorry. You're saying between Descartes and Bacon. Did you mean
Descartes and Bacon? Yes.
Okay.
And you can see him almost plagiarizing certain passages of Bacon. But in addition, then you see in Hobbes some important parallels with Descartes, right? The cogito, for example, right?
Sure.
And the cogito is a manifestation in Descartes of the will to have something firm and established, firm and lasting in the sciences, so as to better master nature, right? A Baconian concept clearly derived from Machiavelli that Hobbes too shares, to say nothing of other parallels. So even if it isn't a direct influence, I think very strong cases can be made for the ideas changing form and still finding their way into later thinkers. To say nothing of, I think in some of Locke's private communications, he indicates his strong affinity and his deep reading of Machiavelli.
Yeah, that's right.
Let's get into some of kind of the nuts and bolts. Greg, you delineated kind of 4 themes in the text that you usually guide students toward. I mean, you'll do a reading straight through, but we could potentially just take one of these themes and trace it up through. With bearing in mind the claim that Machiavelli is the founder of modernity, that probably needs to be explained. But we can trace his kind of understanding of nature, this reimagining of nature or philosophy. That's another good topic, and see how kind of philosophers after Machiavelli took that idea and kind of changed the course of the world with it.
Yeah, we should definitely talk about, let's take up first this question of nature and fortune. The last 3 chapters of The Prince deal with this directly. If I could sort of lay out the problem, and I think I'll let Alex jump in here and clarify.
And before you do, let me just, since I'm obviously the undergraduate in this stupid podcast,
Whoa!
Well, no, I'm just kidding.
This podcast isn't stupid.
No, it's my education. I should be so thankful to both of you. Listen, we didn't the ancients figure out nature? Why the hell do I need a reinterpretation from Machiavelli? Right? Isn't Plato, Aristotle sufficient? Frankly?
I think that's an excellent question. Yeah. So as you look at the 25th chapter, I'll go back and forth here and jump around just a little bit, but this is where he speaks about it most clearly. But I think you'll see 2 general things that I would point out here with respect to how Machiavelli sees nature differently from the ancients, and then Alex should jump in as well. I think the ancients, they took nature as their guide. So they clearly, I think they had an understanding of nature. Maybe we can debate a little bit how similar it was to Machiavelli's, but in general, Aristotle, for example, right? Nature provides us with, maybe we'll do a podcast on Aristotle. We can show how this is problematic, but I'll give a kind of overview of Aristotle. Nature gives us the guide. Nature gives us the telos, the end. And insofar as it does that, we then can pursue it. So we should live our life in accordance with nature. Yes. Nature, to exaggerate, is good. Insofar as it provides us with these standards. For Machiavelli, nature is nasty. Nature is not hospitable to human flourishing. It throws up roadblocks all over the place. And if you want to succeed in life, you have to conquer nature. You have to. He deifies nature into Fortuna, this ancient pagan goddess, and so he flips back and forth between speaking about nature and fortune in these last few chapters. And when he's talking about fortune, really the idea here is you have to conquer it. So the first major distinction I would say between the ancients and Machiavelli is his stance toward nature. It's something to be conquered. It's something to be surpassed. It's not something that provides a goal. It's something that, by nature, should human beings fly? No, but we can conquer that, right? I'll give you one small example of this, and I'll move on. But right, when a city floods, we moderns, being influenced by Machiavelli, think, well, we need to build better levees, or we need to orchestrate our city in some better way. The ancients would have said the fact that your city flooded is a sign that you're hubristically building cities where you shouldn't be building them. The gods don't want you to do this. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I'm sorry to dominate this, but so the first thing is the stance, right? The posture toward nature. The second thing is a focus on only a part of nature. For Aristotle, there were different facets of nature that one had to sort of try to understand if one wanted to understand a thing. The material cause, the formal cause, the final cause, the efficient cause. For Machiavelli, the efficient cause is what he really wants to focus on. We need to figure out how to make things work. I don't care if we understand some deeper truth, or he definitely doesn't care about metaphysical truth or anything like this. Well, he may, in fact, personally, but at least outwardly, that's not what's important. What's important is efficiency. How can we be effective in the world? You should jump in here, Alex, at some point. I know you want to tackle this.
Yeah. I think one thing I'd add to that is that according to the Aristotelian, and I use that term loosely as I think you've been using it too.
Yeah.
According to the Aristotelian view, it's not just nature, but experience, right? Ordinary experience is reliable.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, also ordinary language. When we speak about the world according to the way it seems to us, it generally reflects the way things are, right?
Yeah.
The dog I see is going to have that persisting form over time, right? Subject to generation and perishing, of course, but it has a kind of persistence in its natural kind or its natural form that's then reflected in my experience and therefore in my speech. This is not the case with these early moderns, right? For Machiavelli, right, especially when it comes to political things, and this is much more the case with Bacon and Descartes, form is something imposed upon matter, something that's imposed by human will on matter. And this reorientation—
That's great.
Yeah. So for Aristotle, matter takes on a certain form according to the sort of reproduction of a natural kind, let's say, right? But according to Descartes and Bacon, especially Descartes, when he uses the example of the wax, I don't think people realize often how powerful this is. You're imposing a kind of form onto matter. You're looking at all of matter as though it is wax, as though it can be molded into whatever you want, right? And that reflects a very, I think, modern view that's foreign to Aristotle. Another distinction I would draw on the political level, as opposed to the level of natural kinds or objects in the world, is that for Aristotle, right, man is a rational animal and therefore political. We are at home in the political world. That's where our perfection is to be found as moral political beings. Again, this is Aristotelianism. This is a sort of roughshod version. According to Machiavelli, or actually, let's just look at Hobbes because it's a bit clearer there. Man is not going to incline to politics except because the state of nature is so ugly, because life there is so nasty, brutish, and short. So our desire to go into a political arrangement or a political community is a self-serving idea. It's for the sake of our self-preservation, not for the perfection of our nature. It's a kind of brute animal impulse as opposed to a kind of higher human purpose. And so man's relationship to politics fundamentally changes as well, where we're going in there for self-interested as opposed to sort of more generally moral or political purpose, as would be the Aristotelian position, right?
And hence the importance of the founder, right? The founder is the one who's bringing order to the political out of disorder, right? I mean, this is why these excellent princes that he talks about in chapter 6 are so important. These are the guys who are, I mean, like you said, right? They're imposing order on the world. They're bringing it into being. And that's why he's much more interested in the effective cause, the efficient cause. The matter is less important than the efficient guy who's giving form to the matter. Yeah, that's excellent.
So Machiavelli, so I have a question. Machiavelli sees himself making a distinct— is it fair to say that he understands his project to be making an explicit break with the ancients, while at the same time he seems to rely heavily, especially in the discourses, on the ancients themselves? And Greg, you earlier used this phrase "mirror of princes." We can explain that, but these paragons of statesmen for Machiavelli, they're all ancient examples for the most part.
No question. And so to your question of is there a rejection of the ancients by Aristotle and that sort of stuff, that's about as explicit as it can be in The Prince without being explicit. I mean, he's rejecting Aristotle, he's rejecting Plato, he's rejecting the thinkers, he's rejecting the Greek philosophers. I think I've told you this story before, but I heard Mansfield say one time that he suspects that Machiavelli could read Greek, but that he suppressed that in his writings, and so didn't want people to know that he read this sort of pansy, sort of soft Greek philosophy stuff. So you're right, in the discourses there is a kind of return to ancient things, but it's a return to the ancient Roman virtue. So it's a return to the action. So he admires the ancient actors Alexander, Caesar, right? But he doesn't give any indication whatsoever that he admires the ancient philosophers.
Yeah, and I would add to that when he tells their stories, it's Machiavelli's version, right? Which is not to say he's being dishonest, but saying that the lessons he draws from it, the way that he casts it, they fit his narrative, right? How he understands their actions. So
Sure.
I think this is nowhere clearer than with Moses, right? Where Moses fits into, the narrative of Exodus, and that narrative has Moses, being aided by God. And Machiavelli acknowledges this, but sets it aside and says, yeah, but you can understand it wholly in terms of my science of politics. And when you do that, you've in a way created a new theory to fit old facts, right? Just as you can have a geocentric and a heliocentric view of the solar system, or the planetary system, I guess you would call it. You can have two different theories to fit the facts. Everything looks the same, is recognizable, yet the lessons gleaned from it are distinctively Machiavellian. So the ancient examples are often fit into this narrative of necessity, of fortune, of virtue, et cetera, of a enslaved and dispersed people, as he puts it in that chapter 6 of The Prince, as sort of indeterminate form, ready to take on indeterminate matter, rather, ready to take on whatever form you want. That's a very Machiavellian way of reading these stories. And so while, it seems like a nod to, the biblical author or Xenophon or et cetera, the new author is Machiavelli. And I would venture to say that that's often the case, if not always the case, in the way he tells these stories. This is why I think it's so important to look at his sources and how he differs from the sources, because I think therein you see the sort of radical shift of his project, what he's leaving out and what he's changing.
So I guess this is a stumbling block for some people, but we're talking about Machiavelli like he's a philosopher. The three of us contend he's a philosopher, but he doesn't. If you were to pick up The Prince or the Discourses, they don't read like your characteristic books of philosophy. They're not programmatic. They're not systemic like Kant. I mean, this is you don't
systematic. I think you've been paying attention too much to the news lately.
Oh yeah, well, anyway, that's right.
Are those people philosophers?
Yeah, so I'm not even going to touch that, Alex. But so he doesn't read like a philosopher with any kind of system. Yet we're talking about him as if a Machiavellian lens can be applied. A lens of analysis can be applied to events. How does that work?
I'll take a crack
and even
at starting
even when you read him, right? I mean, you were just talking about the footnotes, right, Alex? I think the disjunction between what Machiavelli seems to be saying to the casual reader versus the reader that chases down the footnotes and discovers that he's in fact mangling them, the primary sources.
Yeah, I think just to that point quickly, I mean, I think what Machiavelli would say is he reads these texts judiciously. This is how he speaks about the Bible, for example. But so in general, I think that, Alex's point is spot on. He's using, I think, contemporary language would say, appropriating these texts for his purposes. To your question of is Machiavelli a philosopher or not, I have a couple of points. One is you're absolutely right. This gets to what I was saying just a moment ago about if it's true that he read Greek. I have no idea, by the way, but if it's true, and I think the reason that Mansfield would say something like this is that if this is true, it would seem to imply that Machiavelli, if he was a philosopher, was trying to suppress that fact. He didn't want it widely known that he was a philosopher. Now, why would he not want that known? That's a whole nother can of worms. But let me just sidestep that and address the question of whether or not he was a philosopher. There are a few giveaways. They're sprinkled here and there. I'll just give a few. In chapter 14 of The Prince, when he's talking about what a prince should know, he says some things that really sort of change, I think, the tone a little bit. It's a little out of step with what came before. He talks about how princes ought to know the nature of things. He repeats this phrase over and over. So there's, I realize this is small, but if we understand a philosopher to be someone who's trying to understand nature, that's there. we've already mentioned
Can I touch on that real quick before you move on?
by all means. No,
Because
by all
chapter
means.
14, I think, so he says there that almost the whole of the prince's knowledge is the art of war, right?
Yeah,
And
that's
I
right.
think what you're referring to is this, is it Philopoemen? Right.
Yeah,
And he's out on campaign, and whether in peace or in war, he's thinking about war. And one of the ways he does that is even when he's just out hunting, or he's out with, or they're moving forward and they have yet to meet the enemy. He's talking about the lay of the land, talking about where the enemy could surprise them, and how maybe you would approach a hill, right, in case there's somebody behind it, to make sure that you're secure against it, right? These sorts of conditions are questions of practical wisdom. Right.
yes.
And the sort of inquiry, the speculative inquiry there is a sort of contemplative version of that wisdom, a kind of investigation of practice in the most far-reaching sense. This is very similar to what you see in Bacon, I think, but I think it is important to recognize that when we start thinking about how science is incorporated into society now, and we're trying to investigate all the different possible things that could go wrong, right? When the Pentagon is coming up with all sorts of contingency plans should, X, Y, or Z, improbable situation arrive. That's a kind of version of that speculative investigation of the role of chance in human life, which is a kind of investigation of nature, maybe not akin to the ancient investigation of nature, but I think it's enough to say that he's a modern philosopher in that sense. But sorry,
That's right. No, that's great. I just want to add to that. In that same chapter, he seems to divide the things. It's weird because Alex is absolutely right. He's talking about war, military things, right? But the first part really talks about how the prince should know nature, and he goes through these kinds of examples that Alex just mentioned. But then the second thing the prince ought to know, I would say, would be the human things. And so there's this convention, this sort of accepted philosophic distinction between understanding nature and then understanding humans as somehow different from or a part of nature, but understood differently in its own right. So at the end of chapter 14, he talks about the books that a prince ought to read. And I would say those are books that sort of try to lay out an understanding of human nature. Mostly those books are not books by philosophers, but there is one notable exception, Xenophon, who was a student of Socrates. And so he does tip his hand a little bit, I think, there and say, actually, I am interested in these. And the only book, by the way, in the entire book, The Prince, that Machiavelli recommends to us to read is a book by Xenophon. And so there is this strange way that he's tacitly pointing to the fact that Xenophon might have helped him to understand the way the world is.
So interestingly enough, Xenophon, until recently, thanks to your single-handed Herculean effort, Greg,
Thank you very much.
Given the credit as having been a philosopher.
I think you're kind of downplaying it a touch, but yeah, fine.
I think another point to bring up, and I think maybe you're working towards this, Greg, was the one time philosophy or philosopher is used in The Prince.
This was you and I were talking about this recently, and this is something I don't think I had paid sufficient attention to. This is great. You're talking about chapter 19, yeah?
Yeah, and the problem, just to lay out the kind of political issue that he's considering there, is that in Rome,
right,
to appease the military, you had to be too cruel to appease the people, and to appease the people, you had to be too merciful to appease the army. And so every prince was, in a way, sort of doomed, right, from the beginning. Yeah. And he kind of breaks them into two categories: those who are too cruel, those who are too merciful. And the only exception to this really is Marcus Aurelius, right?
Right.
And he's called the philosopher. He's called the philosopher, I think. And he says the only reason he was able to rule well, I think, if I remember right, is because he was born into the situation, which I think a very revealing clue about the nature of Machiavelli's understanding of philosophy. And I think this helps us understand how he is a philosopher if we just follow the steps, right? Marcus Aurelius was a philosopher who by chance happened to have power, right? Machiavelli does not have power. Lorenzo de' Medici, to whom The Prince is dedicated, he has the power. And Machiavelli is writing him with his knowledge. One of them being this lesson about Marcus Aurelius. So it seems like Marcus Aurelius had, by fortune, what Machiavelli does not have. Machiavelli notes his, horrible fortune that he's got. And so he's, in a way, by appealing to Lorenzo, and maybe we could touch on the rhetorical aspect of The Prince, because I think this gets at the nub of the relationship of philosophy to politics that's distinctive of his understanding of philosophy. But in addressing him to Lorenzo, I think he's trying to achieve that unification of knowledge and political power that the ancients never would have ventured. That Bacon, certainly, right, his most famous dictum, which isn't really from Bacon, but the idea that knowledge is power, that sort of unity of knowledge and power that Marcus Aurelius had, Machiavelli's trying to achieve.
Can I just jump in real quick?
And just, sorry, one last point
Sure.
to David's point. I think that I lost my train of thought. Go ahead, Greg.
You keep going, because I just had one small point to make here, was that I think that precisely to try and bring about what never would have happened except by chance, this union of political power and philosophy, I think that's partly key. You tell me if I'm wrong, Alex, to why he's maybe not broadcasting that he's a philosopher. In other words, philosophy has a certain reputation. Philosophers are thought to be these unrealistic, head in the clouds types. And so to the extent that he wants to bring about this union, he has to radically revise either the image of philosophy, or he has to sort of recast himself as something other than a philosopher. I don't know if that helps, but
yeah,
I didn't mean to derail the track you were on.
No. Let me add to that. But first, to go back to the prior point, I remembered what I was going to say. Perhaps the disorderly manner in which his thought is presented, or the less than systematic, or to use David's term, systemic order of the work. Perhaps that's owed to the fact that he's appealing not to fellow philosophers, but to a prince. But I would also say on that point, when Machiavelli talks about conquering fortune, we have to ask, to what extent is that possible? What aspect of fortune can we conquer? And I think we all know, and there's countless articles and books written on aspects of this, that Machiavelli's rules have exceptions. In fact, he often contradicts his rules, right? There's exceptions often within the same chapter, as when he's laying out these rules, you find exceptions to them. And we realize, I think after a little while, that, well, by objecting to him, we're already playing his game. And anybody who's interested in political power, who reads Machiavelli and objects to him, has already bought into the Machiavellian project, if not these specific rules, these Machiavellian rules. And perhaps that relationship, that people begin to take science more seriously, or what the investigation of history and of the human things can lend political practice, that's the part of fortune he's trying to conquer, right? To give philosophy a firmer place in the city, that the ancients were pretty clear is just not going to happen. Does that make sense at all? Right? That there's a specific part of fortune that he seems especially interested in conquering, and that concerns the fortune of philosophy or the philosopher.
How is he securing philosophy's place in a way that Plato didn't?
Well, so I would, first of all, Plato, doesn't address princes in specific, right?
Right.
And when he does promise, in the Republic, it seems like he promises that this education will make you politically efficacious. I mean, it involves a lot of math. And with the exception of Lincoln, I don't think many statesmen like math, right? And a lot of metaphysical investigations. It takes a long time of investigating abstruse, abstract topics that, seem completely devoid from politics. So it has a kind of tempering effect, or a kind of an effect of rejecting, the person who might go there to seek practical political wisdom. I don't think you get the same with Machiavelli, right? I've heard it said, this might be, made up, that what's his name? The Italian dictator. Mussolini had a copy of The Prince, right, by his bed. I don't think anybody would say that of the Republic, right? Would Mussolini have the Republic?
Well, apparently the Ayatollah referenced Plato's laws, for what it's worth.
Really?
Yeah.
That's we can credit Averroes with that, right?
Yeah. Oh, I hope
credit.
Not. Yeah, probably.
For that.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So look, I think that the Plato's political project, such as it was, the political efficacy was trying to make philosophy respectable within the city, making it tolerated. I think that Machiavelli was trying to make philosophy useful to the city, make it sort of like, hey, we're gonna come in and we're gonna advise you on how to rule.
I guess,
and we're gonna do it in politics, but we're also gonna do it in natural science. You're gonna have this Bacon guy who's gonna come along and say, we're gonna listen. I mean, we don't even call them philosophers anymore, right? We call them scientists. I mean, I don't know how much. Hopefully, this will get published during the what we're going through right now. Maybe it'll come to an end, hopefully before. But right with the coronavirus, I guess I said that wrong. Anyway, with the coronavirus, I mean, look at how often we're just like, if someone's a scientist, and I'm not saying this is bad. I'm just saying like we just listen to them. All right. I think that's a new thing in the world in the last 500 years, where there's this new class of people. And by virtue of having scientists attached to their name, they have some authority. And I think that we don't call them philosophers, but that they're people who inquire into the nature of at least the natural world.
Yeah. And I would just your first point
Sure.
about making philosophy useful, I'd say he makes philosophy tolerable by making it appear useful to the city.
But how much of that is
one
dependent,
small point on the,
how much of that, what I don't get is how much of that is dependent on a careful or esoteric reading of Machiavelli, and how much of that is just on the surface?
That's a great question.
I would say, yeah.
All right, go on. No. Go
Sorry,
on.
yeah, I would say almost not at all. I mean, when you read The Prince, even at a first glance, right? When in chapter 2, he said, just take the basic lessons. The natural prince, right? The hereditary prince, but he calls it natural there. They're pretty secure. Maybe by some chance event, you'll lose it, but, more or less, it's guaranteed that you'll get it back. Chapter 3, that's out the window, right? Machiavelli shows how his lessons drawn from history can allow you to overcome the strength of the ancient prince. And it just grows from there till he shows that through, the proper study of these things, or at least listening to him, you can really become a founder. And that's explicitly the lesson he's trying, or the view he's trying to impart to Lorenzo in chapter 26 at the end of the book. So I think the most superficial reading that doesn't investigate any of his examples, but just kind of follows them for what he claims that they teach you, that alone creates a kind of desire for his knowledge. At least that's the way that the work is rhetorically structured, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. But I also think his influence on others. I mean, I think Machiavelli was conscious that some of his bigger effects would be indirect, that others would have to sort of take up the task that came after him. Hobbes, Spinoza,
Yeah, it's interesting.
Bacon.
It's interesting. You think about that. It's all it takes is lightning to strike. Like all it took was 2 or 3 people getting it.
That's right.
And and then the world shifts in a different direction intellectually.
Yeah.
I mean, that's amazing, right? So you have all these idiots reading his book, right? Or every I was gonna say, what was the Shakespeare line? Every Tom, Dick, and Harry. Thousands of people reading this book, and they don't pick up on any of it. And then Bacon comes along, Descartes comes along, Locke. Yeah. It's amazing. They seem to get it, and they seem to carry on this conversation with one another. But some people reject that. I don't know, but
yeah, and I think it's important to know that though we can have moral outrage, and people did have moral outrage at Machiavelli's teaching. You mentioned these books, right? Like How to Be a Machiavellian Baker or whatever. There's also an aspect of it that's quite, intriguing, titillating. It's transgressive, and the reader is inclined to find something interesting in that. And I think for the right person, Machiavelli understood that precisely what makes him, so condemned or damned, also makes him quite interesting, right? The fact that it's compelling. I mean, we've all met people who try to be conniving or try to be, tricky, and, they're kind of dumb, right? And you just kind of write them off. The fact that he's so smart and he surprises you page after page keeps you reading, like a good detective novel or something like that.
I'm always amazed by decent students who are delighted by reading Machiavelli. It's a strange phenomenon. I mean, there's this sort of vicarious delight that they take in sort of bad things happening, I think. Nice. And maybe we should talk at some point about, because this is something we've been talking about the whole time, just about, his reputation for being morally bad, which I think was a part of his project. I think he was trying to reorient how people thought about morally good, morally bad things.
So Greg, really quick, Alex, you may be making the same point. You need to. This is a very interesting claim you made early on in the conversation, that he has to be bad in order to be good, or something like this. Could you say more? Was that what you were going to say?
I was going to just add one thing, that I think Greg has this really interesting comparison of Machiavelli to Jesus, right? On this point, precisely, right? Which I think is related to what you were asking about, David.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so what's that song? You got to be cruel to be kind. Is that too old for you guys?
What is that? The refrain of your weekend? I don't know what the. Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know how to say this. I mean, there's a way in which he's a great admirer of Jesus and trying to accomplish the same things, but I think his critique of Christianity, his critique of Jesus's morals, such as it is that he doesn't think you can accomplish Jesus's goals by Jesus's means.
Mhm.
That is, I think he thinks that if you actually want to benefit the world, you've got to do some nasty stuff. You have to be cruel to be kind. You got to do nasty things first. And this, I think, we learned this from both Christianity, at least, and we learned this from Greek philosophy, at least superficially, that, you ought to live a morally decent life and let the consequences come as they may, right? Socrates is put to death. Jesus is executed. And you should do the right thing no matter what. And Machiavelli is saying, no, if we really want to benefit the world, we need to learn to be nasty, because if we don't do it, only the evil people will be nasty. And so I think he really is trying to reorient our thinking profoundly, to sort of recalculate our sort of moral calculations, right? So I'll just give you a few examples. In chapter 15, which I think is the central chapter, maybe the most radical chapter, although that might be 19. Chapter 15 might be the most radical chapter insofar as he's basically saying, throw out Christianity, throw out Greek philosophy. They're both bad guides for how to live your life. If you really want to live in this world and live well and secure your place in this world and to be able to do well for others, you have to be willing to adapt, and you have to be willing to do some nasty stuff from time to time. So he goes through a list of 10 or 11 qualities that a prince is reputed to have, that a prince ought to have. And he sort of goes through and walks through them and says, look, should you be kind, or should you be harsh? Should you be effeminate, or should you be sort of manly? And he says, look, the answer honestly is it really depends upon the situation. And the only quality that I can tell, and I'd be anxious to hear Alex correct me on this, there's only one quality that Machiavelli seems to think that the prince ought always to have, period, and that's prudence. And the prince ought prudently to make use of those qualities that will help him to secure his kingdom. Even if they're bad, a prince, he says, has to learn not to be good. And I mean, the book abounds with examples of princes executing people, fratricides, right? Parricides. We didn't go into this too much, but his account of how you ought to behave, your posture toward fortune or nature, is extremely blasphemous or sacrilegious, right? You have to act as though you can conquer God himself if you want to help rule the world. So obviously that's, I've departed a long way from the initial question of how this is Christian. But if you think that Jesus was trying to come and to improve the lives of all human beings, not just the Jews, right? As Paul will say in one of the epistles, then you really think that Jesus is really trying to improve the lives of others. Machiavelli is doing the same. And he says this, by the way, explicitly in his letter dedicatory to the other book that Alex has already mentioned, Discourses on the First 10 of Titus Livy. There he says explicitly, I'm doing what I'm doing for the universal benefit of mankind. That's at least what he's trying to do.
Yeah. I would add to that, I think this in a way loops us back around to his critique of Christianity, right? He's arguing that human beings are such, right, that this is how you have to deal with them, right? So when he advocates for cruelty, he actually argues that excessive mercy is cruel. Why?
Yeah.
Because if you're too merciful, people will start taking advantage of it, right? This is a kind of deterrent notion of law enforcement. But if you're too merciful, people are going to take advantage. Murders come around, and then people get upset, right? There's a lack of stability. Likewise, if you're too cruel, they're going to say, what's the point of this? I'd rather just risk getting rid of this person and get somebody else in power. So the name of the game is striking such a balance between cruelty and mercy that stability or political order is achieved. And so I think what's, he's essentially saying is, well, look, the church gets involved in temporal affairs. It gets involved in politics, and it brings to bear on politics its spiritual authority or the sort of spiritual allegiances that it has. And that's all fine and well until, people start, behaving such that they can't protect themselves, right? There's a kind of simplified or foolish form of Christianity that's too reliant on the church and therefore loses sense of the scope of worldly or temporal affairs. Once you reorient to that, you realize that no, political stability is a great good, right? The idea of preserving a prince in his power is a great good, provided that the self-preservation is taken for the sake of making people content with the status quo. And in a way, I think this relies almost on a kind of view of human nature and of human beings as in a kind of fallen state, right? This is just the ugly nature of temporal affairs, and you'd be a fool to reject it, as some Christians are fools to reject it, because the very livelihood and the well-being of people in this world relies on these ugly means. That's what it means to be fallen, you could say.
I just want to add to that and to amplify that, right? So your emphasis on temporal affairs, Alex. One of the things, Alex, that I think Machiavelli is saying is that one of the problems with Christianity is that for the promise of heaven, which he calls an imaginary principality, Christians are willing to suffer the worst injustices in this world, in temporal affairs, and the only world that is in Machiavelli's view. And so what he really wants to do is to attack our attachment to the other world and to try and remind us that this is the world. This is the world. And if you want to live with the promise of heaven, you're going to come to ruin in this life. And so I think that this emphasis on realism, this is the only world, this is really central to chapter 15 as well. And the idea here that a lot of these folks who are guided strictly by moral things are living under a kind of delusion that things will somehow be reconciled in something like an afterlife. You see this in Christianity, of course, but I mean, he sees it also in Plato and to a lesser extent Aristotle, I would say.
So let me ask you, sorry, go on. Go on, Al.
So just to add one more point to that, just because we've talked a little bit about Machiavelli's influence. When we talk about this world and the other world and Machiavelli's reorientation to this world, I think it's also important to emphasize that Nietzsche, who was a great admirer of Machiavelli, uses just this terminology. And when he calls the true world, whether it's the world of Platonic idealism or the world of the Christian afterlife, he calls it a fiction, a fable. He calls it a kind of moral optical illusion. And when you see these kind of aesthetic terms, right, these terms of art, that's exactly what he's talking about when Machiavelli is talking about when he talks about imaginary republics. So I think this is a very far-reaching critique. Nietzsche obviously had Machiavelli in mind because he refers to him so many times, but that's a deep and lasting influence over many, many centuries, right? Nearly half a millennium, that Machiavelli's thought is having its effect of this critique of Christianity and this refocusing of the human will towards this world and human desire.
So we have just a few more minutes for the end of our episode. And really quick, let me just remind listeners, if you've enjoyed this, please do rate us well wherever you download and listen to your podcasts, and subscribe, and enjoying your friends to subscribe. I guess the last question I wanted to take us out on is how do we suspect Machiavelli would have rated the success of his project? And Christianity is at a nadir in the West, the Christian impulse. Do you think that he would say his project somewhere along the line went off the rails? And if that's the case, is the antidote to what ails us, can that still be found in Machiavelli's writing itself?
Yeah, that's a great question to end on, David. I guess I'll give the great professor answer, since in other words, a Weasley answer. I think he would have been very impressed, and I think he would have been very saddened. So I'll just begin with the impressed part. I think if you get at the end of The Prince, Machiavelli is leaving you with the indication that there's no limit to what human beings can do if they adopt his stance toward nature. We don't know the limits, and so we can do whatever we want if we set our mind to it. So we don't know the limits. Let's press it. So we've been to the moon. That would be very impressive to him. I think he would be blown away by the scientific progress that human beings have made, and I think he would take some pride in it, because I think he was self-consciously trying to cultivate that. In the political world, I think Machiavelli would look at the 20th century, maybe the end of the 20th century, and say, this is what he wanted. I mean, he wanted republics, right? I mean, he was, the world in 1500 was governed almost exclusively by princes or tyrants. We didn't get too much into this, but I think Machiavelli evinces a clear preference for republics. I think that he would have been very pleased with that. I think he would probably be somewhat displeased with at least in my understanding, my sense of the world is that republics, we don't have the faith or confidence we had in republics 10 to 20 years ago. So I think he would be disappointed by that. Of course, there's some other things he would have been disappointed about, but I think by and large, he would have been impressed by the science, and I think he would have been impressed by the politics, and especially, let me say, I do think he would have been impressed by the United States of America. We didn't get too much into this in the chapter on fortune, where he talks about, look, nature, he likens it to a river, and he says human beings ought to dike and build dams and dikes to sort of make that river, to harness its power and to make it work for human purposes. I think he would look at the United States of America and say that we built institutions, we separated branches, we did things, we sufficiently diked and dammed political affairs such that it has led to an enormously successful imperial republic. I apologize if that's a phrase that Americans don't want to hear, but I think Machiavelli wanted an imperial republic, and I think he would have been proud with a republic that spanned an entire continent. Alex, do you want to add anything there? I don't know how proud he would have been about like Justin Bieber or something like this, but in general, nothing but impressed.
Well, I mean, doesn't he have that comment on festivals and things like that?
Yeah, the people have to have their festivals. Maybe he would have been happy with that.
So I mean, far be it from him to make much of.
I was actually, I don't know if you know this. I was supposed to be in Florence right now, but thanks to the virus, I'm still here in flyover country, as Alex called it the other day in a text to me.
Yeah, shameful.
I'm here in Central Ohio. I could instead be sipping nice wine in Florence right now.
If I think Italy had to choose between coronavirus and Greg McBrayer, I think they got the lesser of two evils. So
they'd go with the Rona?
Machiavellian choice,
Yeah.
My heart goes out to the Italians.
Yeah, of course. Of course.
I think
to all of our Italian listeners, we're deeply sorry.
Yeah. I do think that, I mean, you mentioned being proud of America, and I think in many respects that's true. One thing I would say, and you called it an imperial republic, and I could see some aspect about that. I do think there is a kind of vestigial isolationism that maybe is rooted in a kind of Christianity. There's a lack of self-assertion and self-confidence, a lack of glory for the warlord nowadays, especially in the West. That is would trouble Machiavelli.
I think that's right.
And now I think part of that is owed. I'm not sure to what extent Machiavelli would have predicted a mathematical physics in the sense of a kind of natural science. There is that passage in chapter 14, of course, but even there, it seems more like responding to chance than it does inventing sort of technology of the sort that we have today. And I wonder to what extent that technology and the sort of social place of modern science has exacerbated these two Machiavellian passions, acquisitiveness and fear, to such an extent that the fear and the desire to insulate yourself through technology, through medical science, through even with social media, when we kind of restrict ourselves to certain groups and we tend to go into an echo chamber, how that fear of death, that fear of confrontation, that fear of acquiring too much, and the general tendency to point to acquisitiveness as a kind of evil, that I think might let Machiavelli down. Maybe he'd be let down with us, later thinkers, maybe with himself for not doing X, Y, or Z. But I do think it is a kind of mixed legacy for Machiavelli. I do think there's a serious lack of the kind of virtue that he was trying to get towards.
So are you saying, Alex, that a Machiavelli, is there a potential that where technology, the role of technology in politics and society has rendered a Machiavellian politics unworkable?
Let me.
Or is that just too hard?
Let me clarify the point by recalling something from earlier. I know we've gone over, but I'll just make this point quickly. Machiavelli says that a people that's dispersed or enslaved is like kind of raw material that you can form however you want. That concept, I think, somehow, I don't know exactly how, makes its way to Descartes in the notion of all matter as mere extension, as moldable in the way that wax is, right? He reducts all natural kinds to this. That is an application, you could say, of a Machiavellian insight about the formable character of all peoples to natural science. The difficulty is that when it comes to natural science, it becomes less about political glory by forming a people and then thereby being able to, conquer beyond, et cetera, becoming a great founder. And it becomes more about making the world so that it satisfies you as an individual. It's obviously a group project in Descartes, but it's a very quick step from the world is wax, I can form to be as I wish, to, living your life in an echo chamber, only reading things that either upset you or please you and nothing that's sort of reasoned and sober, right? And that application of the formability of nature, Machiavelli, it's a kind of political or human nature, the applicability to that to natural objects, etc., I think isolates people in a way that it might not have been. Yeah.
So Alex, what you're saying is that the proper antidote to the consumerist view of technology and this sort of isolating view is people need to listen to the new Thinkery regularly.
I thought you were going to make a joke about me saying "Workers of the World Unite," but yeah, they should listen. They should listen to us. That's exactly.
You're a professor. You don't work. They should listen to us.
That's a good.
Right.
That's a good note to end on. Thank you, guys.
Right.
Thank you, David.